There was that very early sense brought in by Maimonides, who was exposed to the Islamic thinkers and the philosophy that the Quran teaches, that brings this religious freedom in. He teaches all is foreseen and free will is given as a way of balancing between God's power and human responsibility. So our religious freedom is connected to our physical freedom, which is based on peace. Survival will always trump all. The rabbis define that through observance of commandments, which again has its centerpiece of loyalty and obedience to God. But they also develop the holiday of Yom Kippur with its sense of individual atonement and communal atonement, which again requires a sense of free will to have made a mistake to atone for, and a willingness on God's part to allow mistakes and free will even as part of the bigger project. And the rabbis get into some just remarkable arguments that can only be described as arguments of free will. In one of the classic ones, one of the rabbis goes so far as to say, you can't prove that this is what God wants because a voice from heaven says so, when a majority of the Sanhedrin rules the other way. Democracy, somehow in the midst of all of this, starts to trump even God's word, somewhat successfully. And it's not until the Middle Ages that all of this gets resolved, and it gets resolved by Maimonides, living under Moorish influence in Spain, under Muslim influence, that really brings in this element of religious freedom to what Judaism is. And probably the best way I can summarize it in one teaching, Maimonides, on the one hand, summarizes the responsibilities of a parent towards their child. You have to teach the child Torah. You have to teach the child a profession so they have a career and a way to make a living. You have to find them a spouse, and you have to teach them how to swim. And again, swimming is that element of survival in any medium. And then the very next thing Maimonides teaches after that is the responsibility of the adults of the community in establishing public schools. And things like the ratio of teachers needed to students in ways and in equations that are still the foundation piece of public education today. So there was that very early sense brought in by Maimonides, who was exposed to the Islamic thinkers and the philosophy that the Quran teaches, that brings this religious freedom in. He teaches all is foreseen and free will is given as a way of balancing between God's power and human responsibility. And then finally we get to the modern world, and you can look at the influence of Jewish thought on Jefferson. You can see the role that the early American community, Jewish community in America was, small though it was, in establishing religious freedom, in the letters that were written to George Washington when he became president, in the response to General Grant's Order Number 11 kicking the Jews out of Kentucky and Tennessee, that was so loud and so vital that it was immediately overruled by President Lincoln, in Justice Brandeis's embrace of learned hands concept of where the limits of freedom are, and particularly in the growth of Judaism, which brings me here today and is a good place to stop. I wouldn't have a voice in the community were it not for the religious freedom we enjoy today.
Unitarian Universalism is a group that was formed by two Protestant dissident groups during the Reformation in 16th century Europe. Both groups were persecuted for their religious beliefs, which is why for us as Unitarian Universalists, religious freedom is so important to us. The Unitarians believed in the oneness of God, so they were rejecting the idea of the Trinity. The Universalists believed in universal salvation, and they believed in a loving God who extended salvation to all of us. So they were rejecting the idea of the elected or the chosen few. So there were, throughout our history as Unitarian Universalists, people who were persecuted for these beliefs. Michael Servetus, who lived in about 1509 to 1553, was a Spanish theologian and medical doctor. He was burned at the stake in Geneva because of his beliefs of rejecting the Trinity. Joseph Priestley, who was a Unitarian minister in England in about 1791, had his laboratory burned down because of his Unitarian beliefs, again rejecting the Trinity. And George Beneville, in 1703 to 1793, was also a medical doctor and a Universalist, who spread universal salvation through Europe and in America. He was imprisoned for his beliefs and then emigrated to the Americas in 1741. John Murray, who also established Unitarian in Massachusetts, was also behind the idea of the separation of church and state, so that there should not be a state religion. So these are all really important beliefs for Unitarian Universalists, the idea of religious freedom. Also, Unitarian Universalists, which joined in 1961, have also championed the idea of creating a more just society. They were very active in the reform movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. Universalist Theodore Parker with the abolition of slavery, Susan B. Anthony with women's votes, Universalist Charles Spear with the idea of prison reform, Clara Barton with the idea of nursing and the American Red Cross, and Dorothea Dix with the idea of rights and dignities for those in mental prisons at the time. And then Unitarian Universalists have been very active in the civil rights movement of the 60s. They were among those who answered the call to come to Selma when Dr. King issued that call. And one Unitarian minister, Reverend James Reeb, was murdered in Selma during that time. So today we're very interested in the intersectionality of all oppressions and working to create a society that tries to eliminate and address those things, whether it be racial justice, sexual justice, immigration rights, classism. Unitarian Universalism is a non-creedal faith, so we don't have a set of beliefs. We are seekers searching for truth and meaning, and we're guided by our 7 principles, which govern how we engage with each other and the world. They include the inherent worth and dignity of each person, and also a free and responsible truth for search and meaning, and the respect of the interdependent web of which we're all a part. So for us, religious freedom is extremely important because, again, we don't have a definition of the divine, and the divine goes by many names. And so, again, we believe in the church, the separation of church and state, and also providing sanctuary for those fleeing persecution, which, of course, we've been seeing today in terms of travel bans on those of specific religions, the breaking up of families in terms of people who are already here, who may have emigrated or come over as children. So again, all of these are really important to us as far as religious freedom and the importance of preserving that religious freedom in our society at a time when those rights are threatened.
When I think about religious freedom, I think about 3 dimensions. We can be talking about belief, we can talk about practice, we can talk about identity. And I think that all three elements are of importance, although the last one can be dangerous. The importance of religious belief and of free exercise are things that I find enshrined both in the American Constitution and the First Amendment and in what I call Islamic pluralism, concepts that are in the Quran that talk about the necessity for people to be allowed to practice their religion. In the case of the Constitution, I think it came about as a practical matter that the American colonies had quite a diversity of mainly Christian religions. But, you know, the potential for conflict is actually greater the closer you are to somebody else. Sure. It's easier to be tolerant of somebody who say, well, you know, they don't know any better, than someone who is almost there and say, how can they possibly believe that? A lot of people seem to think that religious freedom should be restricted to matters of belief. You know, you believe what you believe and I believe what I believe. And that as soon as you start talking about religious practice, then somehow it's not as important or it's somehow different. But to me, religious practice and belief shouldn't be separated. As one man once said, when asked about this question, whether belief or practice whether belief or deeds was more important, he said, that's like asking whether hydrogen or oxygen is more important in water. If your belief is not reflected in your deeds, then do you really believe it? And if your deeds are for some purpose other than your beliefs, well, as the Quran says of those people who do something, a deed for something other than the pleasure of God, they shall have their reward. Whatever it was they were seeking, they'll get that. But in the hereafter, they will have no portion. Now, on the question of religious identity, as I said, I think this is something that is quite dangerous. People have the right to their religious identity. But there's a tendency to try to think that your religious identity is somehow a virtue that puts you above other people. And that just doesn't make any sense to me. Whatever religion we may have been raised in, like whatever ethnic group we might happen to belong to, we get no credit for that. So, but as far as religious freedom is concerned, and of course, I don't know what you can do about religious freedom when it comes to identity anyway. You're stuck with your religious identity, whatever it is, unless you convert, in which case there's the issue of the religious freedom to convert. And if we're going to be honest, as I think we have to be, this has been a problem for the Muslim world. Islam has a very good history of tolerance when it comes to tolerating other people's beliefs and their practices. Muslims didn't even impose the Islamic religious law on people who didn't subscribe to it. So while alcohol, use of wine, is absolutely prohibited for a Muslim, Christians, for whom it was used in their communion services, were never prohibited from having it. As a matter of fact, in those cases where the state did get involved in the liquor industry, they would just appoint a Christian or a Jewish minister of wine so that the Muslims didn't have to have any part of it. But when it comes to conversion, that has always been a problem for people who want to leave Islam. And it's something on which there is no justification in the Quran. The Quran has some harsh words about turncoats who fight for the other side, but that's not a question of mere conversion. So as someone interested in Muslim religious scholarship, I've tried to track down where this came from. And apparently it's all rooted in a single hadith, the hadith being the sayings of the Prophet and his companions, which were originally orally transmitted and written down usually quite late, long after the Prophet and his community passed on. But there was a hadith where someone said, if someone changes his religion, kill him. And I find this problematical. What does the word changes his religion mean? If someone converts to Islam, are you supposed to kill him? That's certainly not been the opinion of the scholars. And anyway, could it be referring to someone who fabricates about his religion as opposed to someone who converts to another religion? And then there's also the problem about whether it's even authentic anyway. In the scholarship of the hadith, it's called the hadith science, a hadith has to have two independent chains of narrators because there are oral traditions before they're accepted. This one does not. It traces back to a single person. So, I would have to say that what we're dealing with here is not a problem with the issue of religious freedom, but a problem of Islamic jurisprudence, where something has entered the tradition that doesn't belong there. As for the Quran, when it deals with the question about people who have wrong beliefs for whatever reason, and remember the Quran is God speaking in the first person, the Quran says, leave me alone to deal with the creature I created, bare and alone. And ultimately, finally, there's the verse that says, La ikraha fid din, let there be no compulsion in religion. All Muslims are agreed that this means you can't force someone to become a Muslim. I've never met a Muslim who didn't concede that point. But the fact is, if you understand the Arabic word deen, it is a word that, although it means religion, is a synonym for justice, and has even been used by Muslims to mean the Islamic way of life. So what it's saying is not just don't force people to convert, but it's saying in your Muslim way of life, as a matter of justice, let there be no compulsion. And ultimately for me, this is what religion at its heart is all about. Certainly in the case of Islam, Islam means submission to the will of God. Now how can you choose to submit to the will of God unless you have the freedom of that choice? And I don't just mean conversion. I mean in your actions of your everyday life.
One of the things we'd all notice in all the conversation today is that you cannot really talk about religious freedom without talking about political freedom. And as James Madison really got right, those freedoms are dependent on freedom of speech and association and assembly and the ability to make your own choices. Christianity began as a persecuted minority religion. Its very existence was threatened by the Roman Empire. It began as a reform movement within Judaism. And it really appropriated and shares that great story of liberation, the Exodus story. In fact, the Apostle Paul characterized the gospel of Jesus as the gospel of freedom. For freedom Christ has set you free. And so in the first centuries of its existence, the church formed this tight community, an intense identity. But it started to grow rapidly in the eastern Mediterranean region as it struggled to get a foothold in lands under Roman control. And so to survive in this kind of hostile environment, the church held its identity together by the way it practiced and by it worshipped, but it obeyed the laws of the state, even those ones that they abhorred. Christians were told to be model citizens, render to Caesar what is Caesar, and to God what is God. You'd go along to get along. They didn't have either religious or political freedom, but they did refuse to fight in the military. They'd rather be killed than kill. All that changed, of course, when the Emperor Constantine in 313 converted to Christianity. The conversion that scholars still say kind of reeks of Machiavellian political calculus. And so Christianity moved from an outlawed religion to one supported and even sanctioned by the state. This changed everything. When the church now has this cozy relationship with the state, Christians began to serve in the military, and the emperor was kind of brought in to help the church resolve its theological divisions. And so the emperor kind of enforced an orthodoxy and punished its heretics. And once again, you get this kind of oppression of those things that are closest to you. Well, this became the status quo in all those places where Christianity was the dominant faith, in Europe in particular, all the way up into the Reformation in the 15th and 16th century. The church was free to speak its truth, but the state had the important duty of maintaining social order. You all heard about the divine right of kings. The king was God's authority. God placed that authority on the throne as God's earthly ruler. And so what if you had a bad king? Well, God doesn't make mistakes in choosing the king, so you'd pray so God would show you how you needed to repent of what sins, which would be the reason why God gave you a bad king in the first place. And so, once again, the church had to kind of take care of its own sphere, the moral sphere, and allow the state to have its authority. This symbiotic relationship had all sorts of problems, and the oppression which we've talked to, there was an orthodoxy that was enforced. However, there started to be awareness about the early 1600s that this kind of monopoly that the church, at that time the Catholic Church, had and shared with the Holy Roman Emperor, that consistently all efforts to reform in political or religious spheres was being stopped. The church became an oppressive force to people within its own body and also with outsiders, including other minority faiths. And so that monopoly of authority, political and religious, started to be challenged. The great jurist Edward Coke, 1630, talked about the need for vigilance against tyranny. Tyranny of overreaching kings and the tyranny of the overarching church. No man, he said, can be punished for their thoughts. And then, with freedom of speech starting to come out, they can't be pressed for expressing those thoughts. And so you see these pamphleteers in the 1620s challenging the Anglican bishops. One of them, in 1628, attacked them for being profane, proud, popish, pestilent, pernicious, and presumptuous prelates. Of course, the person did not sign the pamphlet. Why? Fear of punishment. Desire for freedom to worship they please without the control of the state and the interference of the state started to come out of 1630 America. The Puritans controlled the religion up there in Massachusetts, and people like Roger Williams and people that started to want to deviate from the orthodoxy challenged the blasphemy rules. They also challenged the mandatory Christian worship on Sunday. And they argued the state cannot force people to conform to the first 4 commandments. They can't demand loyalty oaths to the state, and they also cannot tell you how to worship. Unfortunately, Roger Williams' ideas were not followed elsewhere in the colonies. My tradition, the Presbyterians, arrived from Scotland. They set up their first presbytery, a regional body, in 1707. After the religious wars in Europe, they were very leery of conformity to certain beliefs. They were very bloodied by that 30-year war, sometimes just these little differences of theological issues. And so they started to challenge and start talking about freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and the belief in the separation of church and state. And so we had Madison including those in those great documents, including Jefferson's statute. The issue I think we have today in America is the issues of what we do with that kind of freedom. Karen is talking about the Unitarian Church always being on the side of liberation movements. And I think most of the time you look at Christianity in this country, the church was supportive of slavery. The church, in most cases, supported, at least in the South, segregation. Laws that denied women access to vote, roles in the church. There have been reform movements, but oftentimes there's this danger of the church be this institution that conforms to a political and a religious status quo. Hasn't always been that way. Of course, Dr. Martin Luther King was a Christian leader and was very active in starting to get the church and the society to move in those directions. But the church in many places resisted that. And there's not a very good story of the church being for religious freedom. Today, we have a situation where Lyndon Johnson, the Johnson Amendment, which Mr. Trump is trying to overthrow. He was aware of the church's kind of status quo, the church stopping civil rights, the church getting in the way of legislation that would give rights to medicine and education to everyone. And so he started this idea the church cannot get involved in partisan politics. Of course, Mr. Trump, who got 80% of the white evangelical vote, is using that to kind of ways to bring in the suppressive force. So the danger, I think, of this freedom of religion and the freedom of expression is that that freedom of expression may be misused. Instead of being something that furthers freedom and opportunity for all people, can become an oppressive force. So that's kind of the downside, and I think we have to look for, certainly in the current situation of Christianity in America.
It seems as though when we talk about religious freedom, we're basically framing it in terms of one religion versus another religion. I think in sort of modern times with the rise of secular humanism, the question is, what about the comparing and contrast the difference between believing and not believing?
The founding fathers in their wisdom gave us both freedom of religion and a wording of it that allows those who feel the need to define it as well as freedom from religion. But no government, as we've, I think, all pretty much agreed here, can tell its individual citizens what they can and can't think. A freedom of religion that allows any religious thought to be equally protected, equally valid, equally expressed, has to also allow for the nullity, has to also allow for the possibility that one might choose of their own volition not to express any religious conviction.
We do have secular humanists among us, so practicing religious diversity, however that may occur, while we agree in principle, can sometimes, as we find in our congregations, be challenging. Diversity can always be challenging, but if we allow ourselves to welcome a diversity of opinions, we can be transformed by others who have differing beliefs from us, including those who choose to believe in no God.
I would have to agree with everything that's been said so far. As a political issue, freedom of religion has to extend to everybody, including those who have no religious beliefs. However, I think there's another element that I perceived in the question that maybe needs to be addressed. Whose religious freedom is more at stake in the current secular atmosphere? And quite frankly, as a matter of political freedom, it's hard to find cases where non-believers are having their non-belief or even their non-practice challenged, whereas people who do believe will occasionally get pushed on it. I can think of two examples right off the top of my head. One was a student, I believe it was a Catholic student in a public school, who in the lunchroom finished beginning their meal and crossed themselves, and a teacher came and said, "You can't do that here," and actually, took them to the principal's office, and I think he had to, it had to go to court before it was established that in fact he had perfect right to cross himself when he was about to eat, and there was nothing that the state had the right to say about it. I also read an article just in the last few days about someone who was both religious and gay, and was asked which is more difficult, to be gay in your religious community or to be religious in the gay community. And he said, absolutely being religious in the gay community. He said, when people in my religious community find out about my sexual preference, they just say, look, not my business, let that be between you and God, don't talk to me about it. Whereas when the gay community finds out that I practice the religion, the resistance is very intense. What's wrong with you? You got to change. You got to get rid of that religion. You got to abandon your beliefs. So I think that on some level, the threat right now may be greater to religious people than it is to the non-believers.